My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and welcome to Smash Mammon, our weekly show with the Institute for Christian Socialism. Joining me today is Christian leftist and abolitionist Elle Dowd. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Baptized in Tear Gas, From White Moderate to Abolitionist. Elle, thank you so much for being here with us today. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm joining you from the Chicagoland area where I live with my family, and I'm also serving on the board for SOUL, Southsiders Organized for Need and Liberation, which is an organization that works towards all kinds of equity issues in the city of Chicago, particularly on behalf of Black and Brown people. And so one of the campaigns that I'm working on right now is a water affordability campaign. And I also am a candidate for ministry in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA. So yeah, that's in addition to writing and doing sort of public ministry, that's kind of what I'm up to.
Yeah. And Elle, you are somebody who has identified publicly in this kind of like Christian leftist space. There are photos of you all over the internet doing activist work and bringing that clergy collar into the streets. Can you just tell folks who are with us today, like what it means to you specifically to live out your call as a Christian leftist, just sort of in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, I think I grew up in the Midwest in a white suburb, and I really had heard this idea and really internalized it that, sort of church and politics don't mix, that our faith is something really private, not something that we bring into the public sphere. But the more that I really, spent time with scripture and in my own sort of like journey, the more I saw that actually like our public life is really, really important to our faith, and that Jesus's ministry was all about things happening in our public life. And so politics is just like another word we use sometimes to talk about our public collective life together and how we sort of structure and organize community together. And so I think a lot about, again, growing up, I was definitely part of a church that sort of stressed or like hyper spiritualized the story, and everything was about like going to heaven someday when you die, being saved from not going to heaven, or being saved from going to hell. And it really didn't seem like that version of the gospel made a huge difference in like the daily lived reality for me or the people around me, right? Especially people who are suffering. It kind of was like, oh, if things are bad, don't worry, you'll go to heaven one day. But in scripture, I really saw that Jesus cared about the material reality of people. And that's really evident in all of the healing and teaching and feeding that he did. And I just think a lot about some of the other, maybe more contemporary movements for love and liberation, like the Black Panther Party and their free breakfast program, right? Or their clinics. Like that sort of stuff is the very stuff that Jesus did. And it really makes a difference in the lives of our neighbors in like a physical, real material way, not just existential or abstractly.
Absolutely. And I think that that's something that like there is a little bit of leeway around for the church when it comes to mercy ministries. But I'm going to miss a quote. I'm just inspired because I too am actually originally from Chicago. I'm up in Milwaukee now, church planting, but born and raised in Chicago, was the associate director of Organizing Unity Renewal Society for some years, and have so much respect for SOUL and the work that you do. But when we would go to churches, one of the conversations we would have is like, well, yes. So why then are you asking me not only to volunteer at the food pantry, but also to go out into the streets? And there was this conversation. The quote that I'm going to misquote is like, when I feed the hungry, they call me a saint. When I ask why they're hungry, they call me a communist. And in that context, was very, very dangerous to be called a communist. So, can you speak to that a little bit? How does that connection work for you, that it's about those material needs that Jesus meets, but it also drives us not just to the food pantry, but also to the streets?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, because I think a lot of churches are more invested in maybe top-down charities that serve to sort of reinforce structures of and hierarchies that can be really harmful, as opposed to, like, what we really think of as mutual aid. But I think about this sort of direct services or mutual aid as part of a larger strategy, right? Instead of putting like a Band-Aid on a gaping wound, which sometimes these top-down charities can kind of be, right? It's more about sort of creating like a stopgap measure and maybe relieving a little bit of tension, but not actually about getting to the root of the problem. Justice work and community organizing really seeks to get at the root of the problem, and community organizing at its best brings like the best elements from all these different kinds of engaging in our community, like advocacy, like direct services in the form of mutual aid, and puts that together in more of like a strategy that really seeks to get at the root causes of harm and to stop harm. And so that's also like an abolitionist framework. I'm an abolitionist, and a lot of what abolition is about, sometimes we talk about abolition and we think about just like ending the carceral state, right? Like ending policing in prisons, which it is about that. But even more than that, it's about building the sort of world where everyone has what they need to thrive, and we really get at the root cause of problems so that people can have the kind of abundant life that Jesus promised to us. So in that way, I think like justice work, being in the streets, community organizing, activism, advocacy, all these different pieces, they really fit together to move us forward. The problem is, if we sort of do these isolated from one another, we work in silos. First of all, we're not, unified, and we're less powerful. But also doing some of this more top-down charity work, again, like reinforces hierarchies, as opposed to the example, like, the Black Panther Party, when they talked about these programs like the free breakfast program, they termed them survival pending revolution. So the idea was that it was part of a larger strategy to keep people alive, keep people well, keep people healthy, keep people educated, so that they're able to participate in the revolution, because what good is a revolution if everyone's too hungry to really, even do anything about it?
Absolutely. And so it sounds like there's this kind of reciprocal relationship between mercy and systemic justice that, that feeding people is essential, and we have to ask, why are they hungry? And in order that we might change those systems that keep everyone hungry, we have to keep people fed enough for the fight.
Yes.
The principle of live to fight another day, which is really key in activist spaces. So, you mentioned abolitionism and being an abolitionist. That's something that is not a new framework, but is newly kind of gaining a little bit more traction in more mainstream spaces. Can you just tell a little bit more about what that means to you, and what you mean by the carceral state?
Yeah. So when I talk about the carceral state, it's a more honest way to talk about what we sometimes call our criminal justice system, right? Because our criminal justice system doesn't actually seek or serve justice. It doesn't get, again, to the root cause of problems, but instead seeks to control and repress people through violence enforced by police or other agents of the state. And so abolition is about ending that, about saying, when something goes wrong, when harm is, perpetrated, or when harm occurs, how do we stop the harm? And then how do we sort of, even before the harm occurs, work to prevent the harm by building the kind of world where these things don't happen? Abolition as a framework really recognizes, and is borne up by the data, that most crime that does occur are crimes that are driven by human need or poverty or trauma. And so abolition sort of seeks to solve those root problems to prevent crime, and then seek alternative forms of justice, like true justice, transformative or restorative justice, when harm does occur, so that people can be healed and communities can be healed.
Yeah, and I think that's it's a powerful vision, and it feels so beyond our grasp. I think that there are a lot of folks who dismiss it out of hand as just sort of unrealistic. When we talk about imagining the world without police, imagining the world without prisons, imagining a different kind of healing and transformative justice, people kind of get overwhelmed. And I think that this is where Christian discipleship really comes in to say, like, okay, of all the people, we are the ones, called out by our tradition to have a prophetic imagination and to see the kingdom as something that is already, within us and within the reach of creation through the saving grace of God. And so I get really excited when we talk about it, like, this is the kingdom, when we talk about abolition, this is the kingdom that was described to us that we are called to work toward and co-create with God. But for those folks who are like, well, how do I do that? Like, how do I move toward that world? What are some of the ways that you find you implement that just in your day-to-day life, in your interpersonal relationships? I mean, where do you start?
Yeah, I really like Adrienne Maree Brown, who is an emergent strategist, talks about these different aspects of emergent strategy. And she's also an abolitionist. And one of the sort of concepts is this concept of like fractals, that like the smaller part and the bigger part are related and they mirror each other, right? What we do on the micro level affects how we act on the macro level and vice versa. And sometimes actually these really intimate interpersonal relationships are the place where we practice revolution the most. So that's a great question. And I would say one of the main ways that I try to practice or like live into an abolitionist framework in my day-to-day life is through parenting in our home. And it's hard because I definitely, just like everybody else, grew up with sort of the same kind of messages about discipline or punishment, that if you, quote unquote, spare the rod, spoil the child, that sort of thing. But again, what I've seen in my own home is that if instead of, say something happens in our home, right? Like there's like some sort of harm or some sort of like something's not working for people. A maybe more traditional, if you want to use that word, sort of framework would be like punish the kid, ground the kid, take away screen time from the kid or whatever. But instead, what we have really tried to do in our home is to have a space where people are okay to ask for what they need because they know they're not going to be punished. And that when we really communicate that we're on the same page. So if something goes wrong, it's less of this adversarial relationship, this power struggle where it's like me as an adult with adult privilege over and above my children being like, how can I control you and force you to do what I want to do? Instead of doing that, instead of that kind of, attitude or orientation towards one another in our relationship, it's more of an orientation of like, hey, we're on the same team here. Here's my concerns. I'm seeing this is not working for you either. What do you need? And how can we all help each other get there? So it's a much more democratic and collaborative way of being. And it really, in theory, obviously it like we're not perfect. Like we are still kind of like figuring it out in the day to day, but in theory, it should, seek to undermine some of these like hierarchies of like parent and child or like adult and child, and instead bring us together like in our humanity and say, hey, we're on the same side here. We don't have to push and pull against each other. We can figure out a solution together.
I love that so much because I think that, in more radical, more leftist Christian spaces, we've become more accustomed to talking about things like the domination of empire and things like that. And I feel like this really boils down to the ways that we all have internalized the structures and mechanisms of domination, of empire, yes, of control, and that plays out in our individual relationships. And some of that, personal transformation of, ooh, am I seeking to control this person who's near me, this child who I'm entrusted to care for? Or am I called to something different, something higher, something holier? Is this something that I can practice in, the high stakes moments of building family, building community? And that practice, that spiritual discipline, can not only transform relationships and communities, but the whole of creation as it kind of comes into being. And I love that. So in just the last few minutes here, you wrote this, Baptized in Tear Gas is coming out in August. And
Yeah.
is there more of this kind of framework, these theories, these ideas for implementing in your work coming out?
Yeah. There's a lot of conversations within the book too about sort of interrupting some of our internal narrative, particularly for white folks. But in general too, many of us, like of all kinds of people, have internalized certain dominant narratives around authoritarianism or capitalism or some of these other systems of oppression. And so the way the book is structured is kind of around themes, right? These lessons that I learned during the Ferguson uprising. So before I lived in Chicago, I worked for the Episcopal Diocese of Missouri in the bishop's office. And I began working there just a few months before Michael Brown was killed by white police officer Darren Wilson. And so in the midst of this, uprising, I had the opportunity to be a part of that and learn so much from the people who are out there on the streets. And so a lot of my learning was continually bumping up against and being challenged by the ways that what I was seeing in front of me and the relationships that I was forming were really challenging things that I had grown up believing were true and universal. And so in each of those chapters, right, there's like stories about how that happened, some theological reflection about what that means for us as like disciples. And I really try to live my life and also wrote this book like as a whole person, that it's like, yeah, I go into this as a mom. I'm a mom of now Black teenagers. And that like affects deeply how I see the world and how I operate in these spaces. And so a lot of the sort of discussion and there's reflection and action questions at the end of each chapter are really about how can we live this out in a practical way in our own communities.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm super excited. As a church planter, like I know that's a resource that Zao MKE Church is going to be using. And I know you've mentioned elsewhere that it's like designed in part to be used by congregations to do this reflection communally. And so I am so excited for the impact of Baptized in Tear Gas once it comes out. And folks can pre-order it anywhere now, right?
Yes. Yeah. All the normal places you would normally pre-order books. So IndieBound, Barnes and Noble, all of those places. And there's currently also you can pre-order the ebook or Kindle. Eventually there is going to be an audiobook that's like release date isn't set yet, but maybe in the next year or so too. But you can pre-order now. And if you go to my website, elledowd.com, there's buttons to like take you there in a way that's like easy. If that's, if it's harder to remember to like search Baptized in Tear Gas, but you can somehow remember Elle Dowd. If you go to elledowd.com, there's buttons that'll take you there.
Fantastic. Well, Al, thank you so much for being with us today. And I really appreciate your conversation. Everyone, thank you for joining us this week. Smash Mammon is a weekly show hosted by the Institute of Christian Socialism, a nonprofit organization committed to building a movement of the ecumenical Christian left. You can learn more about the Institute at christiansocialism.com. We are entirely donor supported. So if you want to support our work, you can go to christiansocialism.com/support. I am your host, Jonah P. Overton, and we'll be back with you next week.
Thank you.